If I asked you if you wanted to play a Mario game, what kind of title would you think I was talking about? The most common reply would almost certainly be platformers, and given Mario's early history of arcade games and the influence titles like Super Mario Bros. And Mario 64 have had on the industry, it's no surprise that this is the case. A smaller minority of people might answer the question with party games, seeing as series like Mario Kart or Mario Party are also quite popular, seeing well-advertised releases every few years. For people who have experienced Mario primarily in these genres, it can be difficult to even imagine him as the protagonist of a turn-based RPG. Despite fairly universal acclaim, Mario RPGs aren't well known in comparison to these other types of games. The sheer quantity of Mario titles creates an odd situation, in which fans of the series I listed earlier may not even be aware of games like Superstar Saga, which they would likely enjoy. This review will attempt to keep story spoilers to a minimum, but I will be covering many aspects of gameplay, with upgrades and combat mechanics being examined in depth. If knowing what kinds of abilities you'll have access to ahead of time will hamper your enjoyment of the game, then I recommend you play through it before watching this review. Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga is a turn-based action RPG that released in 2003 for the Game Boy Advance. The game begins with a new villain, Cackletta, stealing Princess Peach's voice and replacing it with an explosive vocabulary. The story follows both Mario and Luigi as they travel to the Bean Bean Kingdom in order to thwart Cackletta's schemes, retrieve Peach's voice, and restore tranquility to both Mushroom and Bean Bean countries. The game itself is mainly split between two different types of gameplay. Turn-based battles, where Mario and Luigi work to defeat enemies they encounter, and platforming, in which the brothers use various power-ups they acquire to solve puzzles and traverse the game's different areas. Following the title screen and a handful of initial cutscenes is a tutorial fight against Bowser that serves to introduce the basics of the combat system. Like most games in its genre, the player chooses which attacks to perform from a list of commands, but Mario RPGs differentiate themselves by having a timing component for both attack and defense. It isn't enough to simply pick the right command, the player also has to be able to maximize damage by pressing the button at the correct time. Defensively, every enemy attack is avoidable, and many offer an opportunity to retaliate with precise button presses. Enemies deal a large amount of damage, so much so that the player is expected to avoid most attacks entirely. I'm quite fond of the timing-based system for two major reasons. First, it's more interactive than traditional turn-based combat. In most turn-based RPGs, defense is proactive. The player either debuffs the enemies or buffs the party before damage happens, but ultimately damage itself is unavoidable and the party members just stand there taking hits. Certainly there's skill involved in this style of play, but I was always slightly bothered by the fact that in many games, even if I played correctly and reduced damage, I would still be forced to helplessly watch as a flashy attack bombarded my immobile party. Secondly, the chance to incorrectly input a command or fail to dodge an attack adds variance, which can change encounters even against the exact same enemies. In most games from this genre, fights against identical enemy compositions play out the same way every time, barring a randomly generated event such as a critical strike. But in Superstar Saga, fights vary based on the player's timing. Failing to counterattack whenever possible or mistiming a button causes the fight to drag on. Unfortunately, when the brothers near the late game and become strong enough to decimate almost all enemies with ease, battles become predictable again, so it's by no means a perfect solution, but this is a systemic problem with the genre in general, and at the very least I respect the attempt to make similar fights more interesting. Like in many other RPGs, player mistakes can quickly snowball out of control, as one brother fainting forces the other to carry them while still avoiding attacks. The extra delay this adds makes it much more difficult to survive, and coupled with the remaining brother only being able to take one turn by themselves, usually spells doom for the party without a one-up shroom for revival. It's pretty neat that the brothers have the foresight to keep defending each other after they fainted and vulnerable on the ground. The game is packed with little details like this that really add to the brothers' relationship. Visually, the game holds up even after 10 years have passed, due in large part to its expressive sprites and detailed environments. The animations and voice work are fantastic too. Even events as simple as Mario and Luigi speaking their garbled Italian are exciting to see. These elements, combined with the charming music of composer Yoko Shimomura and Koji Kondo, give Superstar Saga a whimsical feel that's perfect for the brothers' adventures in a new world. The story of Superstar Saga manages to be pretty entertaining despite its simplicity, and perhaps its greatest strength lies in the setting of the Bean Bean Kingdom itself. It would have been easy to set the game in the Mushroom Kingdom and simply have Bowser kidnap Peach again, but the Alpha Dream team really put the effort into developing a new landscape and original characters. The main antagonist's henchman, Fawful, is extremely memorable in particular. His schizophrenic rambling, absurd metaphors, and extreme narcissism easily make him one of the most interesting villains the Mario Brothers have ever faced. By comparison, Fawful's boss, Cacletta, is fairly bland and basically just an evil witch. But she has several genuinely creepy moments, and her schemes are at least a little more involved than Bowser's normal antics. The game is also quite funny in spite of its family-friendly writing. Much of the humor comes from the duo's interactions with the various denizens of the Bean Bean Kingdom, since many characters have heard rumors about the famous Mario Brothers but don't have any idea what makes them special or capable. The now ancient Game Boy Advance never had many buttons to work with, but Superstar Saga deserves praise for condensing so many actions into the control scheme while being incredibly easy to understand. In combat, the A button always performs Mario commands, and the B button always performs Luigi's, so it's next to impossible to accidentally use the wrong brother when trying to avoid attacks. Outside of battle, however, this constant is no longer the case, with A corresponding to the brother in front and B to the brother in back respectively. In order to cross large gaps, jump higher, and solve various puzzles, the player uses the shoulder buttons to toggle through special abilities. The start button causes the brothers to switch positions, and this is important because some abilities work differently depending on which brother is in front. For example, a certain point in the game grants the duo the ability to hammer one another into the ground, but a different effect is produced depending on which brother is heading up the front. If Mario gets whacked, he shrinks, allowing him to access small spaces. If instead he strikes Luigi, the green plumber burrows into the ground and can move under certain objects. Early on, the shoulder button toggling is intuitive and serves its purpose well, but as the brothers amass more abilities, it can become annoying to switch between commands that are used more frequently than others, such as standard jumping. With no quick way to default back to normal jumps, it can take up to 3 presses of the L or R button to switch back to the simplest move in the game. This is compounded by the fact that many of the puzzles require the brother in front and back to use different commands, and then have both go back to standard jumping since they'll get stuck if one of them doesn't hop over the obstacle. This means a player will often have to press both shoulder buttons a different number of times in succession to get back to jumping, a task that quickly becomes tedious. This problem could have been easily fixed by making it so that holding down the L and R button for a second or two reset Mario and Luigi's commands back to square one, and it would feel much more fluid than it does now. Aside from coins and equipment, beans are Superstar Saga's main collectible, and different types of beans are obtained in a variety of ways, like defeating enemies or for minigames. One such bean, the Chuckle Bean, is always hidden underground. In order to dig them out, Mario must first dunk Luigi and have him resurface below a point on the map marked with an X. It's not particularly challenging or interesting to begin with, but my main gripe is the way the top-down camera's angle manages to make this more difficult than it has any right to be. Blocks are generally less of an issue because the physical block hovering in the air and the shadow beneath it work together to give the player an accurate sense of where they need to jump. But bean patches exist by themselves, so it's much more difficult to judge where Luigi needs to surface. What should be an incredibly easy task can sometimes take 2 or 3 more attempts, although this is a fairly minor issue overall. Going back to the game's timing-based battle system, there are 2 main kinds of attacks. Solo moves are the simplest option. They're easy to execute and hit only once. Bros attacks, on the other hand, are special moves that are more difficult to perform and cost Bros points, but deal tremendous amounts of damage in exchange. The attacks themselves have 3 different difficulty modes, with the easiest using slow motion and giving the player button prompts, making it next to impossible to fail. The hardest mode lacks the slow motion and button icons, but costs far fewer Bros points, making it the go-to option if the player can consistently execute it. I don't like the mode changes overall because most players will use slow motion once or twice to learn the button prompts, and then skip mode 2 entirely to use the difficult version for the rest of the game. Bros attacks are already relatively easy to perform and deal partial damage if the player executes some of the move correctly, so making even more concessions seems like overkill. Later games in the Mario and Luigi series only have one Bros attack mode, but allow the player to freely practice moves as many times as they want from the menu screen out of combat, and I think this is a much better solution than having easier variations on the same move. The final component of the Bros attack system is advanced commands, upgraded versions of the same Bros attacks that deal more damage or have a unique effect, like debuffing the enemy or stealing items. They're unlocked after the player correctly executes a Bros attack a certain number of times, which is nice because it feels as if the player themselves leveled up the move. Unfortunately, it's pretty tedious to unlock all 8 advanced commands because the number of times an attack needs to be done wildly varies. To put this in perspective, Bounce Bros needs to be performed only 8 times, the least amount of any move, but Knockback Bros requires the most at 43 different executions to advance. It absolutely feels more like a grind than a test of skill, and I think a more interesting implementation would have been to greatly lower the amount of times the player needs to correctly do a bros attack, but force them to do it without making a single mistake. Perfectly executing an attack 10 times in a row displays greater mastery than some arbitrary number of moves with as many attempts as you need, and this would allow the player to spend more time choosing the command that's best for the situation without feeling obligated to pick a different one that they still need to use 30 times to level up a move. The various areas of the Bean Kingdom are diverse and well-paced for the vast majority of the game, but one section in particular comes across as blatant padding. Mario and Luigi are eventually tasked with retrieving 7 bean fruits divided across the entire world map, but they're obtained the exact same way as the underground chuckle beans I complained about earlier. One of the beans is gated behind an interesting boss fight, but the other 6 don't require any skill or thought beyond finding the circle of plants and digging in the middle of them. It really doesn't take that long in the grand scheme of things, but in my eyes it's definitely the worst section of the game overall. One of my favorite aspects of Superstar Saga is the way power-ups are designed for use both in and out of combat. Be it special jumps, magic hand powers, or even dunking Luigi into the ground, almost every ability the brothers obtain has some sort of application in battle. The multi-purpose moves really make Superstar Saga feel cohesive, so I'm disappointed that special moves later on in the series become more abstract and unrelated to the rest of the game. What really sets Mario RPGs like Superstar Saga apart from other similar types of games is the way they experimented with mechanics that are generally ignored. I've harped on about the timing system enough, but the concept of trying to make commands themselves more engaging for the player seems extremely underutilized. Very few turn-based games I've played ever deviate from having the player choose an attack and then watching the character perform it, and while I understand that many of these games focus purely on strategy as opposed to execution, it's still bizarre to think that some of the most unique ideas ever seen in an RPG would come from the Mario franchise. In addition, Superstar Saga places more emphasis on out-of-combat mechanics than many other games. The process of traversing and interacting with the environment is part of the core gameplay. It seems obvious that when a large chunk of a game consists of traveling through various areas, it should be interesting in some way. Yet many RPGs still contain lifeless maps with no interesting characters to talk to, exploration, or even engaging movement options. Superstar Saga may not be as well known as other games in the Mario franchise, but even after a decade it stands out as one of the better turn-based RPGs I've ever played. The gameplay is excellent, the scenarios are hilarious, the characters are interesting, the music is lovely, and these elements come together to create a game that's unique even when compared to other Mario RPGs. I've deliberately made sure not to spoil a lot of the story, so if you haven't played Superstar Saga, I highly recommend you give it a try. Aside from its original GBA release, you can find it on the Wii U eShop for under $10. I can't know what lies in store for the Mario Brothers in the future, but I hope that Nintendo continues to believe there's a place for them in RPGs.